Girl DM'd me and said she wanted to share her story about growing up in the Appalachian foothills in Kentucky and why you should never whistle at night. I'll be honest, I don't know much about Appalachian lore as I didn't grow up in Kentucky, but I asked my husband whose family is from Kentucky. I said, were you ever told not to whistle at night? And he said, I was taught never to whistle at all. This is Jane's story. That is her real name, but she didn't want to be tagged. Jane started her email by saying that where she grew up in Kentucky, stories weren't just stories. They were lessons and they were warnings passed down from generation to generation. Jane grew up in a small 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house with her mother and her grandmother. Their closest neighbor was 3 miles away. The house had been in their family for generations. Her great-grandfather had built it himself. Jane's mother worked most days, so she was often left alone with her grandmother. Growing up, Jane was allowed to go play and explore the woods, often unsupervised. Generally, her grandmother would be on the front porch in a rocking chair, smoking cigarettes, drinking coffee, staying within close range. Jane's grandmother was a staunch believer in the idea that kids should be kids and often encouraged her to go and play. Jane said she learned a lot about nature living there. She would always find tadpoles, bring them home and watch them turn into frogs. She would find bugs, build them small habitat. She would watch the baby deer grow up every spring and summer. But Jane's grandmother had 2 rules, and the first was that Jane had to be in the house by dusk, and the second was that Jane could not whistle at night, even if she was in the house. Jane asked why she wasn't allowed to whistle at night. Her grandmother only ever said, it calls them to you, and refused to elaborate. So Jane grew up with the idea that there were monsters or people in the woods that would come if you whistled. So Jane grows up, she goes off to college. Her mother had since fell in love with and married a man who lived in the suburbs of Louisville. Only her grandmother's left living in this house, and Jane doesn't go back very often. There's not a lot for her there. And at this point in her life, she views the place where she grew up just